Scientists sat down to compare Irish and English DNA, and they expected a simple, almost boring result. Two island populations separated by a narrow strip of water. Centuries of trade, warfare, migration, and intermarriage between them. The assumption shared by almost everyone going into the research was that the genetics would look broadly similar. Maybe some regional differences at the edges, nothing dramatic. When the results came back, the assumption was wrong in a way that nobody in the field had fully anticipated. Across the vast majority of England, the genetic match with Ireland was almost nowhere to be found. Two populations living within visible distance of each other on a clear day, separated by as little as 12 miles of open water at the narrowest crossing, and their DNA looked like they had come from entirely different parts of the world. Then, tucked into one specific region, in the north of England, the match finally appeared. Not London, not the southeast coast, the part of England closest to Europe. The north. And the story of why only that one corner matched and why the rest of England is genetically a world apart from Ireland reaches back thousands of years through ice ages, Bronze Age invasions, Viking settlements, and one of the most deliberately planned population movements in the history of these islands. We are going to follow every piece of it today. The breakthrough that made this comparison possible came from a project published in Scientific Reports in 2017. Scientists from the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, working alongside the Genealogical Society of Ireland, built something they called the Irish DNA Atlas. The methodology was meticulous. They recruited 194 Irish individuals whose 8 great-grandparents had all been born within 50 kilometers of each other, somewhere in Ireland. 4 generations of verified ancestry, all tied to specific locations on the island. Those individuals were then compared against 2,039 people from the People of the British Isles dataset, and over 6,700 individuals from across Europe. The goal was to map Irish genetic structure with the finest detail anyone had ever attempted. What they found was not a single uniform Irish population. The island divided into 10 distinct genetic clusters, each one shaped differently by geography and history. 7 of those clusters carried the deep genetic signature of Gaelic Irish ancestry. Populations that had been sitting on that island for thousands of years with relatively little outside influence. The remaining 3 clusters told a different story. They sat genetically midway between Ireland and Britain, a sign that something had mixed the two populations together in specific places at a specific point in time. And when scientists traced where the British side of that mixture had come from, it did not come from England broadly. The best genetic fit for the British component was a mixture of individuals from the center and south of England and the north of England, a cluster designated as the Pennine region. Everything else in England was genetically a world apart. That finding sat at the heart of the entire comparison. But to understand why it happened, scientists had to go back much further than the 17th century. They had to go back to the very beginning of human life on the island. Ireland was not always inhabited. For most of prehistory, the island sat completely empty at the far western edge of the world, locked under glaciers that made human settlement impossible. Then, around 10,000 years ago, the ice began to retreat. As the landscape slowly opened, the first people arrived. They were hunter-gatherers, small mobile bands of foragers who followed animals, fished the coastlines, and moved with the seasons. Genetic studies have identified them as part of a broader group known as Western European hunter-gatherers, who spread across much of Western Europe as the Ice Age ended. And here is the first piece of information that surprises most people. Ancient DNA analysis suggests these early Irish were dark-haired and dark-skinned, carrying physical traits that would look completely unfamiliar to most people in Ireland or England today. They left traces of their camps along rivers and coastlines, including a Mesolithic site at Mount Sandal in County Derry dating to around 7000 BC, one of the earliest known human settlements on the island. For thousands of years, these hunter-gatherers had Ireland largely to themselves. Then, around 4000 BC, everything changed. A wave of Neolithic farmers arrived, most likely crossing from continental Europe, carrying with them a fundamentally different way of life. They brought agriculture, domesticated animals, new burial traditions, and a genetic ancestry tracing back to the ancient Near East. The arrival of these farmers was not a minor cultural exchange. It was a population transformation on a scale that archaeologists are still working to fully understand. Scientists got their clearest window into this moment from a woman buried at Ballinahatti in County Down around 3200 BC. When researchers sequenced her genome, they found it was predominantly of Near Eastern origin, linking her directly to the farming populations that had spread out of Anatolia thousands of years before she was born. She carried some hunter-gatherer ancestry as well, a sign that the two populations had begun to mix, but the scale of the farming migration was overwhelming. Ireland, like much of Western Europe, had been fundamentally reshaped within a few centuries. Then around 2500 BC, another wave of people arrived from a direction that nobody had anticipated. They came from the east, far to the east. Their ultimate origins lay on the Pontic steppe, the vast grasslands stretching north of the Black Sea in what is now Ukraine and southern Russia. These were Bronze Age herders, mobile, skilled with metal, and they had already swept across much of continental Europe before they reached the Atlantic edge. Archaeologists associate them with the bell beaker culture, a widespread phenomenon named for its distinctive pottery, which carried new technologies, new burial customs, and a new genetic signature westward from Central Europe toward the Atlantic coastlines. The clearest evidence of their arrival in Ireland came from 3 men buried on Rathlin Island, a small island just off the northeast coast of Ireland, dating to between 2026 and 1534 BC. When scientists sequenced their genomes as part of a landmark study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the results were striking. All 3 men carried substantial steppe genetic heritage, a component entirely absent from the Neolithic woman at Ballinahady, buried just centuries earlier. All 3 also carried the Y chromosome lineage R1b M269, strongly associated with the Bronze Age steppe migrations into Western Europe. The wave that had swept out of the grasslands above the Black Sea had reached all the way to the northeastern shore of one of the most westerly islands in Europe. This was not a small intrusion. By the end of the Irish Bronze Age, roughly 3,500 years ago, the modern Irish genetic landscape had been largely established. The steppe ancestry brought by the Bell Beaker migrations became a permanent and defining feature of Irish DNA. England went through exactly the same Bronze Age transformation. At this point in the story, the 2 islands still looked genetically similar. That would not last. For thousands of years after the Bronze Age, Ireland and Britain shared a broadly similar genetic foundation, the same ancient hunter-gatherer layer underneath, the same Neolithic farming ancestry above that, the same steppe heritage carried in by the Bell Beaker migrations on top of everything else. If you had compared the 2 populations at the end of the Iron Age, the differences would have been subtle. Then, in the 5th and 6th centuries AD, something happened to England that never happened to Ireland. The Anglo-Saxons arrived. They came from what is now northern Germany and Denmark, crossing the North Sea in enormous numbers after the Roman withdrawal had left a power vacuum across much of Britain. They did not simply settle alongside the existing population. They replaced it, at least genetically, across vast areas of the country. A landmark study published in Nature in 2022 analyzed ancient DNA from medieval sites across England and found that the early medieval period brought a genetic transformation of extraordinary scale. Researchers estimated that around 76% of ancestry in early medieval English samples could be traced back to continental northern Europe, specifically from populations in Lower Saxony and neighboring regions. In the southeast of England, that figure was even higher. One of the largest population turnovers in British history happened not in prehistory, but in the few centuries following the Roman withdrawal. The Y chromosome lineage, R1b L21, which had been the dominant male lineage across both Britain and Ireland since the Bronze Age, collapsed across much of England under the weight of this migration. It survived most strongly in the places the Anglo-Saxons never fully reached: Wales, Highland Scotland, and Ireland, which the Anglo-Saxons never invaded at all. That single geographical fact, that the Irish Sea formed a barrier the migrations never crossed, is the fundamental reason Irish and English DNA began to diverge so sharply after the 5th century. Ireland preserved its ancient Bronze Age and pre-Roman ancestry in a way that most of England simply could not. While England was being genetically remade from the continent, Ireland sat at the edge, largely untouched. The 2 islands had started from nearly the same place. One stayed there, the other did not. A 2023 forensic genetics study that directly compared DNA profiles from 577 English and 500 Irish volunteers confirmed this picture clearly. Comparison with European populations revealed close genetic relationships between the English population and Scandinavian countries, while the Irish population displayed closer genetic links to Western European countries, findings consistent with historical influences such as Viking migrations and the Anglo-Saxon settlement. 2 populations, same island neighborhood, genetically pulled in completely different directions by migrations that one of them experienced and the other never did. By the time the Anglo-Saxon migrations had finished reshaping England, Ireland had already begun accumulating its own layer of outside ancestry from a completely different direction. Around 800 AD, Norse Vikings began raiding the Irish coastline. At first, they came for monasteries, stripping gold and silver from sacred sites before disappearing back out to sea. But raiding eventually gave way to settlement. The Vikings founded long forts, fortified harbor camps along the Irish coast, and from those camps grew some of Ireland's oldest and most important cities. Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Cork, and Limerick all have Viking foundations. Walk through those cities today, and the street layouts in their oldest cores still follow patterns laid down by Norse settlers more than 1,000 years ago. For generations, historians assumed the genetic legacy of the Viking settlement was minimal. Earlier studies using Y chromosome DNA had found little remaining Norse signature in the Irish population, leading many researchers to conclude that the Vikings had come, raided, and left without leaving much of a biological mark. Then, ancient DNA changed the picture entirely. In 2020, researchers published the first genome sequences from Viking burials in Ireland, including remains from Island Bridge in Dublin, one of the largest early Viking age burial complexes ever discovered in the city. The results were unambiguous. The Irish Vikings carried predominantly Norwegian-like ancestry, and that finding immediately set them apart from their counterparts in England. In England, during the same period, Viking settlements showed much stronger Danish genetic influence, reflecting the different geographic origins of the raiders who targeted each island. Norway and Denmark, though neighboring countries, carried distinct genetic signatures that scientists can distinguish in ancient DNA. Irish Vikings and English Vikings were drawing from different parts of Scandinavia. The Irish DNA Atlas confirmed this directly, finding genetic evidence of Norse gene flow into Ireland with signatures most similar to those from the north and west coasts of Norway, where Viking activity was heaviest. That Norwegian layer settled quietly into the Irish gene pool, concentrated along the old coastlines and in the Viking-founded port cities. It was real, it was measurable, and it was entirely different from the Scandinavian ancestry showing up in England at exactly the same time. But hidden inside the Irish DNA Atlas was another finding that nobody had quite anticipated, something that initially seemed almost impossible. When researchers compared modern Irish genomes against thousands of European reference populations, they found high levels of Northwest French-like ancestry running through Ireland. Not English ancestry, not Scandinavian, French. Specifically the genetic signature associated with populations of northwestern France, particularly along the Atlantic coastline. At first, it seemed like a puzzle without a solution. France and Ireland are not neighboring countries. There is no obvious modern population movement that would explain the connection. But the answer was not modern at all. It was ancient. Archaeological and genetic evidence has shown that the populations living along what scientists call the Atlantic facade, the western fringe of Europe stretching from northern Iberia up through Brittany across to Ireland and western Britain, were deeply connected to each other from at least 4500 BC onward. They shared pottery styles, burial traditions, megalithic monuments, and, as ancient DNA has now confirmed, significant amounts of ancestry. The Bell Beaker maritime culture reinforced those Atlantic connections across the Bronze Age, moving people, ideas, and genes up and down the western coast of Europe for centuries. Ireland sat at the northern end of that corridor, absorbing ancestry from populations along the entire western edge of the continent. England shared some of this Atlantic heritage too, but England's relationship with French ancestry was also shaped by the Norman conquest of 1066, which introduced French-speaking aristocratic settlers in a way that Ireland never experienced. Two islands, two very different relationships with France, and yet another reason why, when scientists compared their DNA, the results looked so different from what anyone had expected. Now we come back to the central finding. After thousands of years of diverging ancestry, after Anglo-Saxon migrations and Norwegian Vikings and ancient Atlantic connections pulling each island in different directions, scientists still found a region of England that produced a meaningful genetic overlap with Ireland. But it was not where most people would have guessed. When the Irish DNA Atlas researchers mapped the three clusters of shared Irish-British ancestry they had identified, all three were concentrated in the north of Ireland. And when they traced the British genetic component inside those clusters back to its geographic source, it pointed consistently to the north of England. Not London, not the southeast, not the Midlands. The north of England, specifically the Pennine Hills region, that stretch of upland running down the spine of the country. A 2025 study published in the European Journal of Human Genetics, analyzing over 6,500 individuals using haplotype-based community detection, identified persistent gene flow between northeast Ireland and southwest Scotland as a corridor that has endured for centuries, while also finding a strong genetic barrier dividing southeastern Ireland from western and northwestern Ireland that has emerged in more recent times. The Pennine region of northern England showed a closer genetic affinity to parts of Ireland than any other English population. This was a specific, verifiable, peer-reviewed finding, confirmed across multiple independent studies. Not a broad overlap between two neighboring populations, but a precise genetic corridor connecting the far north of Ireland to the far north of England. Hidden inside that corridor was a story that had nothing to do with ancient prehistory or Bronze Age migrations. It had to do with a deliberate political decision made in the early 17th century, one whose consequences are still clearly written into the DNA of hundreds of thousands of people alive today. In 1609, King James I signed the orders establishing the Plantation of Ulster. The plan was deliberate and systematic on a scale that had rarely been attempted in the history of these islands. The English crown seized vast tracts of land across the northern province of Ireland and redistributed them to thousands of Protestant settlers recruited from Scotland and northern England. It was not an organic migration driven by individuals seeking opportunity. It was a state-directed transplantation of people carried out with the explicit political goal of replacing the Gaelic Irish presence in Ulster with loyalist colonists who would support the crown. The Plantation of Ulster, established by King James III of England and Ireland in 1609, was an organized colonization of the northern region of Ireland, with most settlers coming from the Scottish lowlands and northern England. The settlers came in waves across several decades. Scottish lowlanders crossed the narrow North Channel in the largest numbers because the geographic distance was small, sometimes as little as 12 miles from the Antrim coast to the Kintyre Peninsula in Scotland. But significant groups also arrived from the northern counties of England, bringing with them the genetic signatures of their home regions. They settled beside one another, formed tight-knit communities that often kept to themselves socially and religiously, and over generations married largely within those communities, preserving the DNA they had brought across the water with remarkable fidelity. The Irish DNA Atlas Globetrotter analysis of the 3 Northern Irish clusters that showed shared Irish-British ancestry dated the admixture event to between the 17th and 18th centuries, coinciding almost exactly with the period of the Ulster plantations. The timing was not approximate, it was precise. The statistical models pointed to the same window of history that the written records described. The best genetic fit for the British component inside the Northern Irish clusters was a mixture drawn from central and southern England and from the Northern English Pennine cluster, precisely the regions from which plantation settlers had been recruited 4 centuries earlier. DNA studies have confirmed that the 17th century Ulster plantation had the most profound genetic effect on northeast Ulster, introducing heavy Scottish lowland and English Y lineages, while northwest Donegal resisted this wave and retained older genetic signatures. County Donegal in the northwest, which resisted the plantation wave more successfully than other parts of Ulster, remains the most genetically isolated region in all of Ireland identified to date. The communities that held together through centuries of pressure preserved a genetic profile that connects them directly to the ancient populations that had been on that island since the Bronze Age. Meanwhile, in parts of northeastern Ulster, many people carry genomes today that are nearly indistinguishable from those found in southern Scotland and northern England. History left its mark. The DNA simply kept the record. The genetic isolation that kept Ireland's ancient ancestry intact for thousands of years left behind something beyond a fascinating origin story. It left behind direct consequences for human health that researchers are still working to fully understand. When a population remains relatively small and cut off from outside gene flow for long periods of time, certain genetic variants can become unusually common through a process scientists call the founder effect. A rare mutation present in just a handful of early settlers can spread through a small, isolated community across generations until it appears at frequencies far higher than anywhere else in the world. Ireland is one of the clearest examples of this phenomenon anywhere in Europe. The island carries some of the highest rates on the continent of conditions, including cystic fibrosis, galactosemia, and hereditary hemochromatosis, an iron overload disorder caused by a mutation that quietly accumulates iron in the body's organs over decades, without causing obvious symptoms, until significant damage has already been done. That last condition has a particularly striking genetic history. When researchers sequenced the Bronze Age genomes from Rathlin Island in 2015, one of the 3 men buried there was found to carry the C282Y mutation, the most common genetic cause of hemochromatosis in Ireland today. That mutation has been present on the island for at least 3,500 years. It arrived with the Bronze Age, steppe migrations, and never left. Ireland's geographic isolation meant it was never diluted by the waves of outside ancestry that repeatedly washed through England and much of continental Europe. It concentrated instead, generation after generation, until it became one of the most distinctive features of Irish genetics recognized worldwide. Scientists are now actively using the findings of the Irish DNA Atlas to improve medical research in ways that have real consequences for living patients. Because the Irish population contains subtle but real regional genetic substructures, researchers studying conditions like motor neuron disease need to account for those differences when searching for rare causative genetic variants. A sample drawn from Connaught and a sample drawn from Ulster are not genetically interchangeable, even though they come from the same small island. The regional structure is real enough to matter in a clinical setting. The DNA that makes Ireland genetically unusual is not just a window into the past. For thousands of people today, it is a medical reality. Step back and look at the full picture that the science has now assembled. The Irish genome reflects a layered history that stretches back more than 10,000 years. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who arrived as the glaciers retreated, dark-haired and dark-skinned, nothing like the image most people carry of ancient Ireland. Neolithic farmers who crossed from the Near East and transformed the island around 4000 BC, building the passage tombs and megalithic monuments that still define the Irish landscape. Bronze Age steppe herders whose genetic signature arrived with the Bell Beaker migrations around 2500 BC and became a permanent and defining feature of Irish ancestry for the next 4,000 years. Norwegian Vikings who founded coastal settlements in the 9th and 10th centuries and left a measurable genetic legacy concentrated in the old port cities. And, in the north, plantation settlers from Scotland and northern England, whose DNA is still clearly visible 4 centuries later, stamped into the genomes of hundreds of thousands of living people, with a precision that can be dated to within a few generations. England followed the same ancient path through the Bronze Age, but then the Anglo-Saxons arrived in the 5th century, and the two islands diverged in ways that no subsequent history has ever fully closed. The continental northern European ancestry that flooded into England during the early medieval period never crossed the Irish Sea. That stretch of water held the line with a completeness that no political border or military campaign could have matched. It is why, when researchers ran the comparison, the genetic match appeared in only one place, the north of England, and even that connection was not ancient. It was built in the 17th century by plantation settlers carrying the DNA of Scotland and northern England into Ulster, where it has remained ever since, sitting quietly in the genomes of their descendants, waiting to be read. 2 islands, one narrow sea, and a genetic record that shows exactly how much that water changed everything. The Irish Sea is one of the smallest bodies of water separating any 2 major populations in the world, and it produced one of the sharpest genetic boundaries in all of Europe. Not because the water was impassable. People crossed it constantly throughout history, for trade, for raiding, for settlement, for war. But the crossings that came in the largest numbers, the Anglo-Saxon migration that genetically remade England, never made it across, and the crossing that finally built a lasting genetic bridge, that the Ulster Plantation, was not ancient at all. It was 400 years ago, planned in London, signed by a king, and still visible today in every DNA test taken by a descendant of the people who made that crossing and stayed.